Every academic, every historian, dreams of one moment. It's a moment that most of us only ever read about. It's the moment when a dusty, forgotten piece of the past, something the world has overlooked for centuries, suddenly decides to speak to you. And you alone, it's a whisper from a ghost, a secret shared across time. For 5 years, as a PhD candidate in Renaissance history, I had been listening for that whisper. I had spent thousands of hours in the university archives, a silent catacomb of old books and brittle documents, my life governed by the quiet rustle of turning pages and the faint, sweet smell of decaying paper. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon in the sub-basement of the library, I finally heard it. The story of how my life's work was stolen from me, how my own family betrayed me, and how I finally got my justice. Begins not with a bang, but with that quiet, earth-shattering whisper from a 500-year-old ghost. If you've ever poured your entire heart and soul into something, a project, a dream, a piece of work, only to have someone else try to take the credit, then you are going to understand the rage that fueled me. Hit that like button if you've ever had to fight for your own name, because this story is for you. My dissertation topic was, to most people, profoundly boring. I was studying 15th century Venetian trade ledgers. For years, historians had dismissed these documents as simple records of commerce, endless, repetitive lists of silks, spices, and salt traded between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. But I had a theory. My specialty was in early modern cryptography and linguistics, and I saw something in those ledgers that other historians had missed. I saw a pattern, a faint, almost invisible anomaly in the language, in the way certain transactions were recorded. It was a ghost in the machine of history. My academic advisor, the man who was supposed to be guiding me on this journey, was the legendary Professor Alistair Finch. To me, and to every other student in the history department, he was a god. He was a brilliant, impossibly charming man in his late 50s, with a shock of silver hair, a tweed jacket that always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and a reputation that was nothing short of mythic. He had a best-selling book, a PBS documentary series, and a mind that was as sharp and as beautiful as a diamond. He was the reason I had come to this university, and he, more than anyone, had encouraged my strange obsessive quest. That's the spirit, Petrova, he'd say to me during our weekly meetings, his eyes twinkling with intellectual excitement. Don't look at the main event. Look at the margins. Look at the footnotes. Look where no one else has bothered to look. That's where real history is made. He made me feel like I was his protege, his intellectual heir. I idolized him. I trusted him completely. He was my mentor, my champion. My family, on the other hand, was supportive in their own, uniquely frustrating way. They were proud that I was getting a PhD, but their pride was a shallow, reflective thing. They were not proud of my work. They were proud of my proximity to Professor Finch's fame. I remember calling them one night, buzzing with a new discovery I had made. Mom. Dad. You won't believe it, I'd said, my voice full of excitement. I think the recurring numerical sequences in the ledgers aren't just inventory codes. I think it's a substitution cipher, a form of polyalphabetic encryption that wasn't supposed to have been invented for another 100 years. There was a polite, baffled silence on the other end of the line. Oh, that's wonderful. Honey, my mother finally said, her voice full of a vague, supportive confusion. That's great. So, how is Professor Finch? We saw him on television last night, on that show about the Medicis. He is just so brilliant. He looks so handsome in that new suit. Did you tell him we said hello? They didn't care about my cipher. They cared that I could say I worked with the famous man from the TV. My accomplishments were only real to them when they were reflected in the glow of a more successful, more important man. It was a lonely feeling, but one I had gotten used to. For months, I worked relentlessly, trying to crack the code. I spent my days in the archives, comparing ledgers, running statistical analyses. I spent my nights in my small apartment, surrounded by books on cryptography, my walls covered in charts and diagrams. I was living on cheap coffee and pure, obsessive adrenaline. And then came the breakthrough. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I was in the sub-basement of the library. the only person in the entire building. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the rain lashing against the high, small windows. I had been staring at two parallel ledgers for hours, one from Venice, one from Istanbul, from the same year, and then I saw it, a single, tiny discrepancy. An entry for a shipment of saffron in the Venetian ledger corresponded to an entry for a shipment of arrowheads in the Ottoman one. It was the key, the linchpin. My heart started to pound. The words weren't just words. Saffron wasn't saffron. Arrowheads weren't arrowheads. They were keywords in a complex cipher. With trembling hands, I began to apply the new key to the ledgers. And as I did, a secret, hidden story, a story that had been silent for over 500 years, began to emerge. The ledgers were not just trade records. They were the coded diary and the secret correspondence of a Venetian spy, a man named Antonio Dinardi, who had been embedded deep in the court of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II in the years leading up to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. For the rest of the night, I worked in a fever dream of discovery. I translated. I decoded, my pen flying across my legal pad. And the story that unfolded before me was a bombshell. It was a story that would rewrite the history books. Historians had always believed that Constantinople had fallen due to the sheer, overwhelming military might of the Ottoman forces. But Antonio Dinardi's secret diary told a different story. It told a story of political intrigue, of betrayal, of a secret conspiracy. It detailed how a cabal of powerful Genoese merchants, Venice's greatest rivals, had secretly sold the Ottomans the advanced cannon technology that had allowed them to breach the city's impenetrable walls. It was an act of economic treason, hidden for centuries in the guise of a spice trade. By the time the sun came up, I was sitting in front of a pile of notes that I knew would change everything in my field. I had done it. I had found my discovery. I had heard the whisper from the ghost. The next 2 months were a blur of joyful, obsessive work. I barely ate. I barely slept. I just wrote. The words poured out of me. I turned my discovery, my notes, my theory, into a coherent, powerful, and irrefutable academic argument. I crafted my dissertation, my life's work, my masterpiece. The day I finished, I printed out a single, beautiful, spiral-bound copy. It was 350 pages long. The title was The Silk and the Sword Espionage, Betrayal, and the Secret Economic History of the Fall of Constantinople. I held the manuscript in my hands. It was the proudest moment of my life. And the first person I wanted to share it with was my mentor, my champion, Professor Finch. I walked to his office, my heart soaring. He was in, sitting behind his large, cluttered desk, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when I walked in, and his face broke into his familiar, warm smile. "Lena, my star pupil," he said. "Come in, come in." "Professor," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. "I finished it. The dissertation. It's done." I placed the bound manuscript on his desk. He picked it up, his expression one of genuine admiration. He read the title aloud. "The Silk and the Sword," he murmured. "What a magnificent title." He looked at me, his eyes shining with what I was so sure was pride. "You did it, Lena. I always knew you had it in you. I knew there was something hidden in those boring old ledgers. I couldn't have done it without you," I said. And I meant it with every fiber of my being. "You were the one who encouraged me to look." "Nonsense," he said, waving a hand dismissively. I just pointed the way. "You were the one who did the hard work. You are going to be a star in this field. This is a career-making piece of work. I am so incredibly proud of you." He stood up and gave me a rare, paternal hug. "Leave this with me," he said, tapping the manuscript. "I will read it over the weekend, and we will meet next week to discuss the next steps. Your defense, publications. The sky is the limit for you now, my dear." I walked out of his office that day, feeling like I could fly. My life's work was complete. My hero was proud of me. My future was a bright, shining, and limitless horizon. I was so full of hope, so full of trust. I had absolutely no idea that I had just handed the man I admired most in the world the weapon he was about to use to destroy me. The first week after I handed Professor Finch my dissertation, was one of the happiest and most liberating of my life. For the first time in 5 years, I was free. The immense, crushing weight of my research was gone, replaced by a giddy, floating lightness. I had done it. I had completed my life's work. I slept for 10 hours a night. I went for long walks without thinking about 15th century Venetian encryption methods. I met friends for coffee and talked about things other than my thesis. I was a normal person again. I was buzzing with anticipation for my meeting with Professor Finch the following week. I imagined the conversation in detail. He would tell me my work was brilliant. He would help me map out a plan for publication. We would discuss which journals to submit articles to. We would talk about turning the dissertation into a book, my future, which had been a long, dark tunnel of research for so long, was now a shining, open road. The email from his assistant arrived the morning of our scheduled meeting. Subject: meeting cancellation. Body: Miss Petrova. Please be advised that Professor Finch has been unexpectedly called away on urgent university business and will be unable to make your meeting today. His office will be in touch to reschedule. Thank you. Victoria, Administrative Assistant to Prof. Bertrand. Alistair Finch. I felt a pang of disappointment, but I brushed it off. Of course, he was busy. He was a very important man. He traveled for conferences. He sat on boards. He advised the university provost. I sent back a polite reply. Thank you for letting me know. Victoria, I look forward to hearing from you about rescheduling. A week passed. The promised email to reschedule never came. I sent a polite follow-up directly to Professor Finch. Dear Professor Finch, I wrote, I hope you're well. Just wanted to follow up on our meeting to discuss my dissertation. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts when you have a free moment. Best, Lena. The email vanished into a digital void. No reply. Another week went by. The giddy lightness I had been feeling started to be replaced by a familiar, cold knot of anxiety in my stomach. I saw him once on campus, walking across the main quad, his silver hair catching the sunlight. I called out his name. He turned, saw me, and his eyes widened for a fraction of a second. Then he gave a curt nod to the person he was walking with and quickly changed direction, disappearing into a different building. He was avoiding me. The realization was a slow, creeping dread, the self-doubt, which had been my constant companion for 5 years and which I thought I had finally vanquished, came roaring back. My mind started to spin with terrible possibilities. He hated it. He thought my thesis was a piece of amateurish garbage, and he was too embarrassed for me to even tell me to my face. My groundbreaking discovery was probably a foolish mistake, a fatal flaw in my methodology that his brilliant mind had spotted in an instant. I wasn't a genius. I was a fraud. And he, my hero, was now ashamed to be associated with me. The thought was so painful I could barely breathe. I called my parents, hoping for some reassurance. It was a mistake. You haven't heard from him, my mother said, her voice full of a concerned disapproval that was her specialty. Well, Lena, he is a very, very busy man. You can't expect him to drop everything for a graduate student. Perhaps your work wasn't as compelling as you thought. And you accused a professor of what my father asked when I tried to explain that I had seen him actively avoid me. You shouted his name across the quad. Good heavens. Lena, you probably embarrassed him. You have to understand your place in the academic hierarchy. He is Alistair Finch. You need to be patient and respectful. I got off the phone feeling worse than ever. I felt small, foolish, and deeply, deeply ashamed. My family was right. My mentor was right. I had gotten carried away. My discovery was likely nothing, and I had wasted 5 years of my life on a delusion. For the next 2 weeks, I was in a spiral of despair. I stopped going to the library. I avoided the history department. I just sat in my small apartment, the silence a testament to my own failure. The joy of my accomplishment had turned to ash in my mouth. The discovery that would change everything, the moment that would turn my despair into a new and terrifying kind of rage, happened by accident. I had finally forced myself to go to the library to return some overdue books. To avoid the main history section, I took a shortcut through the periodical room. It was a quiet, sun-filled space, lined with racks of academic journals from around the world. And there, on the new arrivals display, was the latest issue of the Journal of Renaissance Studies. It was the most prestigious, most respected, and most difficult to get into publication in my field. To be published in its pages was the dream of every historian. The cover of this issue featured a beautiful, high-resolution image of a 15th century Venetian galleon. I felt a pang of my old, now dead excitement, my subject, my world. I picked up the heavy, glossy journal, mostly as a way to torture myself, to see the kind of brilliant work that was being published while my own was gathering dust on my professor's desk. Deemed unworthy, I flipped it open to the table of contents, and my eyes scanned the list of articles. The currency of power, Medici banking and papal politics, gender and artistry in the court of Isabella d'Este. And then I saw it, the title that made my blood run cold, The Sword and the Silk. A new perspective on the fall of Constantinople. It was my title, a slight variation, but it was mine. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. It's a coincidence. I told myself, someone else was working on a similar topic. It's a coincidence. But then my eyes moved to the right, to the author's name printed in crisp, black, authoritative text, by Professor Alistair Finch. The world tilted on its axis. My hands started to shake so violently that the pages of the journal rattled. A roaring sound filled my ears. No, no, it can't be. With a trembling finger, I flipped to page 12, the beginning of the article. There was his name again, in big, bold letters, and underneath it, the beginning of the text. I started to read, and I felt a sense of vertigo so profound I had to grip the edge of a nearby table to keep from fainting. I was reading my own words. It was my introduction, almost verbatim, my argument, my thesis statement. He had changed a few adjectives, restructured a sentence here and there, dressed my prose up in his own more eloquent, more confident style. But the bones, the heart, the soul of the work, it was mine. I frantically flipped through the pages. There they were, my decoded passages from the ledgers, my discovery about the Genoese conspiracy, my analysis of the economic treason, my footnotes. He had even stolen some of my damn footnotes. He had taken my entire dissertation, the product of 5 years of my life, the most important work I had ever done, and he had put his name on it. He hadn't just stolen my work, he had stolen my future. The sound of my own quiet, strangled gasp echoed in the silent library. I slammed the journal shut. The self-doubt, the shame, the fear I had been drowning in for the past month, it all burned away in a single, brilliant, horrifying flash of pure, undiluted rage. He hadn't been avoiding me because he thought my work was bad. He had been avoiding me because he was busy stealing it. His praise, his encouragement, his mentorship, it was all a lie. A long, elaborate, and cruel deception designed to get me to deliver my career-making discovery directly into his hands. I ran out of the library. I didn't even bother to check out the journal. I just clutched it to my chest like a piece of evidence, which, of course, it was. I ran across the quad, my heart pounding with a new, furious energy. I ran to the history department. I ran to his office. His door was closed. I didn't knock. I pounded on the door with my fist, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. "Professor Finch," I yelled, my voice a raw, ragged sound. "Open this door. We need to talk." A door down the hall opened, and a secretary I didn't recognize peeked her head out. "Can I help you?" "I need to see Professor Finch," I said through gritted teeth. The heavy oak door to his office opened, but it wasn't him. It was his assistant, Victoria. She looked at me, at my wild eyes, my disheveled appearance, with an expression of cool disdain. "The professor is in a very important meeting," she said, blocking the doorway with her body. "He cannot be disturbed." "I don't care," I said, trying to push past her. "I need to speak to him now." "I'm afraid that's not possible," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "If you don't leave, I will have to call campus security." I looked past her, into the office. I could see him, sitting behind his desk, his back to me. He was on the phone. He wasn't in a meeting. He was hiding from me. He was a thief and a coward. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving, my mind reeling. Then I looked down at the journal in my hand. Proof? I turned away from his office without another word. The time for confrontation would come, but it wouldn't be here, in a hallway. It would be a battle fought on my terms. I walked back to the library, back to the periodical room. I sat down at a table, the offending journal open in front of me, and I began to plan my war. He thought he had all the power. He had the reputation, the connections, the fame, and he had my work. But I had something he didn't. I had the truth, and I was going to use it to burn his entire, celebrated, fraudulent career to the ground. My rage was a clean, cold flame. It burned away the shock and the tears, leaving behind a hard, diamond-like resolve. He would not get away with this. I would not let the man I had idolized, the man I had trusted with my life's work, turn me into a footnote in my own story. I knew confronting him in his office again was pointless. He would hide behind his assistant, behind closed doors and claims of important meetings. A man like Alistair Finch, a man who lived and breathed public perception, could not be confronted privately. He needed an audience. So I waited. I waited for 2 hours in a small coffee shop across from the history department. The hateful journal open on the table in front of me, its pages filled with my own stolen thoughts. I watched the clock. I knew his undergraduate seminar, The Age of Discovery, ended at 3 p.m. I knew he always lingered afterwards, surrounded by a throng of adoring, sycophantic students who hung on his every word. That would be my stage. At 3:15, I saw him emerge from the building, his silver hair glinting in the afternoon sun. He was, as always, holding court, a charming, tweed-clad king surrounded by his young disciples, all of them laughing at some witty remark he had just made. I took a deep breath, picked up the journal, and walked across the quad to intercept him. "Professor Finch," I said, my voice loud and clear enough to cut through the students' laughter. He turned, and the charming professorial smile on his face froze when he saw me. He saw the journal in my hand, and for a split second, a flicker of pure, cold panic crossed his face before he could hide it. "Lena," he said, his voice a little too tight, "I'm in the middle of a discussion with my students." "I'm sure you are," I said, my voice as cold as his. "But I need to have a word with you about your latest publication. I found it fascinating." The students looked from his panicked face to my furious one, their own smiles fading, sensing the sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere. "This isn't the time or the place," he said through a gritted, polite smile. "Then your office," I countered. Now, it was not a request. He knew he was trapped. To refuse to speak to one of his own PhD candidates in front of a dozen undergraduates would be a bad look. With a sigh of theatrical reluctance, he dismissed his students and led me back into the history building, to his office, the office that had once felt like a warm, scholarly sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He closed the door behind us, and the air was thick with a new, hostile tension. He sat behind his massive, cluttered desk, the picture of a weary, important man being bothered by a troublesome student. I did not sit down. I stood before his desk, and I slapped the open journal down on it with a loud, satisfying thud. The pages were open to his article, my article. "This," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I could no longer contain, "is my work, my research, my discovery, my words. You stole my dissertation, and you put your name on it." He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the journal. He just looked at me, and his expression was not one of guilt. It was one of profound paternal disappointment. He sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I were a problem he was just too tired to deal with. "Oh, Lena," he began, his voice soft and full of a terrible, condescending pity. "I was afraid this might happen. I knew you had developed a very strong, proprietary attachment to this project. It's understandable. It's common among graduate students. You get so lost in the research. You begin to see it all as your own." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his gaslighting was like a physical blow. He was going to pretend I was the delusional one. "The core thesis. Lena?" he continued, steepling his fingers, his expression now one of a patient teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "The idea about the Genoese conspiracy, the theory about the economic motivations behind the fall of Constantinople. That has been a private project of mine for years, an idea I have been slowly developing, waiting for the right research assistant to help me with the grunt work." "The grunt work," I whispered, My voice incredulous. 5 years of my life, in the archives, learning to decode a 15th century cipher. You call that grunt work. And you did it beautifully, he said with a brilliant, charming smile. You were the best research assistant I have ever had. Your work was invaluable. You gathered the data I needed to finally prove my long-held theory. But you must not conflate the role of the assistant with that of the architect. I provided the intellectual framework. You provided the supporting evidence. It was a collaboration, one for which you will be handsomely acknowledged in the foreword of my upcoming book. I stared at him, my mind reeling. He had a pre-prepared, perfectly constructed lie for everything. He had twisted our entire relationship, our years of mentorship, into a narrative where I was nothing more than his helpful little secretary. And he was the great man, the sole genius behind the discovery. My words, Professor, I said, my voice shaking. Whole paragraphs of that article are lifted directly from the dissertation I gave you. My words. Our words. Lena. He corrected me gently. From our many conversations, you took my ideas, my theories, and you articulated them in your drafts. It's a collaborative process. That's how academia works. You seem to have a fundamental misunderstanding of the student-advisor relationship. I am so sorry if I wasn't clear about that. I truly thought you understood. He was telling me I was crazy. He was telling me that the reality I had lived, the work I had done, was a delusion. He was so calm, so reasonable, so utterly, convincingly sincere, that for a terrifying second, I almost believed him. A sliver of my old, deeply ingrained self-doubt began to creep back in. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did misunderstand. But then I remembered the long, lonely nights in the archives. I remembered the thrill of the discovery, a moment he was not there for. I remembered the joy of the writing, a process he had no part in, and my rage returned, a clean, hot flame. You are a thief, I said, my voice low and full of a new, cold hatred, and a liar. His face hardened. The mask of the kind, patient mentor fell away, and for a second, I saw the cold, ruthless ambition underneath. I would be very, very careful about the words you use. Miss Petrova, he said, his voice now a quiet threat. You are a graduate student with no reputation. I am a tenured professor with a sterling one. Who do you think the university, who do you think our colleagues will believe? He stood up. The meeting clearly over. I am very disappointed in you, Lena. I thought you had a bright future, but this delusion, this unprofessionalism, I am concerned for your mental state. I think you should take some time off, reevaluate your career goals. He was not just stealing my work, he was ending my career before it had even begun. He was branding me as unstable, as a pariah. I walked out of his office in a daze, his words ringing in my ears. I had been outmaneuvered, outplayed, and utterly destroyed by a master manipulator. The days that followed were a living nightmare. He was as good as his word. His subtle smear campaign was ruthlessly effective. I would walk into the history department, and conversations would stop. Professors I had once had friendly relationships with would now look at me with pity and avoid my gaze. Other graduate students, people I had considered friends, would cross the common room to avoid having to speak to me. The narrative had been set. Professor Finch, the great man, was so worried about his promising but troubled student, Lena Petrova. She was suffering from delusions of grandeur, trying to claim his work as her own. It was such a tragedy. I was an outcast. I was radioactive, at my lowest point, when I was on the verge of quitting the program, of giving up entirely. I did the one thing I had been avoiding. I called my parents. I needed them. I needed someone, anyone, to be in my corner, to believe me. I told them the whole story, my voice breaking with the sheer, raw injustice of it all. I told them about the years of work, the discovery, the dissertation, and I told them how Finch had stolen it, word for word, and was now trying to paint me as a hysterical liar. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Lena, honey, my mother finally said, her voice full of a worried, hesitant concern. Are you absolutely sure about this? Of course, I'm sure, I cried. Mom, I have the drafts, I have the journal, I have the proof. But, darling, she continued, her voice the placating tone she always used when she thought I was being difficult. Alistair Finch. He's such a distinguished man. He's a world-renowned scholar. Why would a man like that need to steal the work of a student? It just doesn't make any sense. Then my father got on the phone. His voice was stern, disappointed. Lena, you are making a catastrophic mistake. You are a graduate student. He is your advisor, a giant in his field. You are accusing a very powerful man of a very terrible crime. Do you have any idea how this makes you look? It makes you look ungrateful, unstable, and unprofessional. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't listening to me. They were listening to his reputation. But he's a liar and a thief, I sobbed. I am telling you the truth. We think you should call him, my father said, his voice firm. You should call him and you should apologize. Apologize for the misunderstanding. Tell him you were under a lot of stress and you weren't thinking clearly. If you do that, if you are humble, maybe he will be gracious enough to let you finish your degree quietly. If you continue with this crusade, you will be throwing your entire future away. You will be blacklisted from academia forever. They didn't believe me. My own family, my own parents, they chose to believe the story sold by the charming, powerful man on television over the desperate, truthful pleas of their own daughter. The weight of his reputation was heavier than the weight of their love for me. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute. It left me breathless. I had been abandoned by my mentor, ostracized by my colleagues, and now, disowned by my own family's belief. I was utterly and completely alone. I hung up the phone. I sat in my small, lonely apartment, the world outside gray and unforgiving. And I finally let myself break. The fight was over. They had all won. My dream was dead. My career was over. My spirit was crushed. There was nothing left. My world had shrunk to the four walls of my small, lonely apartment after the phone call with my parents. A profound and heavy apathy settled over me. The rage was gone. The grief was a dull, constant ache, and all that was left was a vast, echoing emptiness. They had all won. The professor had my work. The university had my silence, and my family had my surrender. I began the slow, painful process of dismantling my life. I started packing my books, the beloved companions of my academic journey, each one the histories of Venice, the biographies of the sultans. The dense tomes on cryptography was a painful reminder of the dream I had lost. I packed them into cardboard boxes, taping them shut like tiny coffins. I was burying my own future. My plan was simple. I would pack my things, I would get in my car, and I would drive away. I didn't know where I would go. It didn't matter, anywhere but here. Anywhere that I wasn't Professor Finch's troubled student. Anywhere that I wasn't the Archer family's great disappointment. I was going to erase myself before they could finish the job. The final, cruelest twist of the knife came on a Tuesday morning. I was scrolling numbly through my social media feed when I saw a post from a former classmate from the history department. It was a link to the official website for the American Historical Association's annual conference, the biggest academic event of the year. Her caption was full of bubbly, innocent excitement. OMG. Look who's nominated for the Kellerman Prize this year, our very own Professor Finch, for that incredible paper on Constantinople. So proud to have learned from him. Congrats. Professor. I clicked the link, my hand moving as if controlled by an outside force, and there it was, on the front page of the conference website, a list of the 3 nominees for the most prestigious prize in my field. The Kellerman Prize was the Pulitzer of Renaissance history, an award that guaranteed its winner instant academic stardom, a lucrative book deal, and a tenured position at any university they chose. It was the future that was supposed to have been mine, and there was his name, Alistair Finch, for his paper, The Sword and the Silk, a new perspective on the fall of Constantinople. I stared at the screen, at the title of my thesis, at the name of my thief, and I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat. It was a laugh so full of bitter, hollow despair that it sounded like a sob. Of course. He was being nominated for an award for my work, of course. He was going to be celebrated, lionized, for the very act that had destroyed my life. The universe wasn't just cruel. It was a comedian with a taste for black. Ironic humor. That was the final straw. I couldn't just leave town. I had to leave this entire world behind. I had to formally, officially quit. I sat down at my laptop, my movements stiff and robotic. I opened my email. I began to draft a letter to the head of the graduate department. Dear Dr. Albright, I typed, please accept this email as my official notification of withdrawal from the PhD program in the history department, effective immediately, due to personal circumstances. I will not be completing my dissertation. I thank you for the opportunity the university has given me. It was a short, sterile, and pathetic letter, a quiet surrender. I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the send button. This was it, the final nail in the coffin of my academic life. All I had to do was press send, and the last 5 years of my life would be officially rendered meaningless. My finger was a millimeter from the button, and then a notification banner popped up at the top of my screen, a new email. My heart didn't even leap. I was too far gone for hope. I assumed it was another job listing from my mother, but the sender address was one I didn't recognize. It was a long, strange string of letters and numbers, ending in Proton Mail. Com, an encrypted, anonymous email service. The subject line was just 4 words. Subject, a word of advice. I almost deleted it. It was probably spam, but some flicker of curiosity, the last dying ember of the historian in me, made me click it open. The email itself was even shorter than the subject line. There was no greeting, no signature, just 2 simple, chilling sentences. We have your original dissertation drafts on file with the university archives, dated and time-stamped. The Kellerman Prize Committee is very thorough in its review process. And then, a final, electrifying line. Please ensure you attend the awards ceremony. It is very important that you are in the room. I read it once, then twice, then a 3rd time. My heart, which had been a dead, heavy stone, began to beat again, a slow, tentative, and then a frantic, wild rhythm. What did this mean? Who sent this? It had to be a prank. A cruel, sick joke from one of Finch's allies, designed to give me a final, crushing dose of false hope before the end. But the details. Dated and time-stamped. My dissertation was on file with the university archives. That was a required part of the PhD process. I had submitted my final draft to them a week before I had given the bound copy to Finch. It was a bureaucratic formality I had almost forgotten about, but it was there, a permanent, official record of my work, with my name on it, dated and time-stamped. The Kellerman Prize Committee is very thorough. The committee was made up of the most respected, most powerful historians in the country. They were known for their rigorous, almost forensic, review process. They didn't just read the published papers. They requested all the supporting research, all the drafts, all the primary sources. A wild, impossible thought began to form in my mind. What if someone on that committee, during their review, had requested Finch's research notes and had instead been directed to the university archives? What if they had pulled up my dissertation, with my name on it, and seen that it was identical to the paper Finch was claiming as his own? It's not possible, I thought. He's Alistair Finch. They would never believe a graduate student over him. But the email, it is very important that you are in the room. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee. It was just a whisper of hope. Have you ever been so deep in a dark tunnel that you've completely given up on ever seeing the light again? You're just sitting on the cold, damp ground, ready to let the darkness consume you. And then, you see it, way off in the distance. Not a bright light, just a tiny, uncertain pinprick of a flicker. And you don't know if it's an exit, or if it's the headlight of an oncoming train that's about to run you over. But it's the first thing you've seen in so long. You have no choice but to start walking towards it. That's what this email was for me. An anonymous, terrifying, an absolutely irresistible pinprick of light in my absolute darkness. My hand moved from the send button on my withdrawal letter. It moved to the delete button, and with a decisive click, I erased my surrender. Then I opened a new browser window. I went to the website for the American Historical Association's annual conference. My hands were shaking again. But this time, it was not with despair. It was with a new, fragile, and terrifying hope. I registered for the conference. I bought a plane ticket to Chicago with the last of my credit. I booked a room at the cheapest, most disgusting motel I could find near the convention center. And then I bought a single, non-refundable ticket to the formal awards ceremony. I had no idea what would happen. I had no idea if I was walking into my own salvation or my final, most public humiliation. I was a gambler, pushing all her last chips onto a single, impossible number. But as I looked at the confirmation page for my ticket, I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer a victim, waiting to be erased. I was a historian, on my way to witness the final, dramatic, and unpredictable chapter of my own story. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see how it ended. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Hilton was a universe unto itself. It was a sea of black-tie academics, of intellectual giants and rising stars, a glittering, intimidating world where reputations were made and careers were forged. And I felt like an imposter, a ghost who had snuck in without a ticket. I was wearing the only formal dress I owned, a simple, dark blue sheath that had felt elegant in my apartment, but now felt plain and inadequate. I was armed with nothing but a single, cryptic email and a hope so fragile, I was afraid it might shatter if I breathed too hard. I found a single, empty seat at a large, round table in the very back of the cavernous room, partially obscured by a massive floral arrangement. From my hiding place, I had a clear view of the main stage, and more importantly, of Table 7 right at the front. Table 7 was the table of honor, and sitting at its center, holding court like a king, was Professor Alistair Finch. He was radiant, basking in the glow of his nomination. He was surrounded by the most powerful people in our field, all of them laughing at his witty remarks, and sitting right beside him, beaming with a pride that was almost blinding, were my parents. My stomach dropped. He had invited them. He had flown them to Chicago to sit at his table, to witness his great triumph. He wanted them to have a front row seat to the final, public validation of his genius and, by extension, the final, public confirmation of my failure. The cruelty of it was so perfectly, so exquisitely, him. My mother caught my eye from across the room for a split second. She didn't smile. She just gave me a small, pitying look, a look that said, "This is what you could have had, if only you weren't so difficult." I spent the first hour of the ceremony in a state of quiet torment. I watched as other awards were given, as other scholars were celebrated, the entire time. My mind was a chaotic battle between hope and despair. The hope, fueled by the anonymous email, told me that something was about to happen. The despair, fueled by a lifetime of experience, told me that I was a fool to believe it, that the world always sided with the powerful, charming men like Alistair Finch, not with the quiet, difficult women like me. Finally, the moment came. The president of the association stepped up to the podium to announce the final, most prestigious award of the night. "And now," she said, her voice echoing through the silent room, "we come to the Kellerman Prize for the most significant contribution to the study of Renaissance history." A polite anticipatory applause rippled through the ballroom. The chair of this year's Kellerman Prize Committee is the esteemed Dr. Evelyn Reed of Yale University. The president continued, "Dr. Reed will now come to the stage to describe the winning work and announce the recipient. Dr. Evelyn Reed. She was a legend, a titan, a formidable historian known for her brilliant, uncompromising scholarship and her brutal takedowns of sloppy research. She was the most respected and the most feared woman in our field." She walked to the podium with an air of quiet, unimpeachable authority. She adjusted the microphone. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and strong. "The Kellerman Committee reviewed over 50 submissions this year, but one, in particular, stood out. It was a work of such profound originality, such meticulous research, and such groundbreaking conclusions that our decision, in the end, was unanimous." She looked out at the audience, her gaze sweeping the room. "The winning paper re-examines one of the most pivotal events of the 15th century, the fall of Constantinople. For centuries, we have accepted a simple narrative of overwhelming military might. This paper, however, argues for a new, more complex, and far more fascinating reality, I felt my heart begin to pound. She was talking about my work, drawing on a previously overlooked set of Venetian trade ledgers, she continued. And I could see Professor Finch at his table preening, a small, humble smile on his face. The author of this paper discovered something extraordinary, a hidden layer of meaning, a complex, polyalphabetic substitution cipher. Previously thought to have been invented a century later, I was listening to a legend, the most powerful woman in my field, describe my own discovery, my own late nights in the archives, to a room full of my peers. It was the most validating and the most agonizing moment of my life. And by breaking this code, Dr. Reed said, her voice full of a genuine intellectual excitement, the author has uncovered the secret diary of a forgotten Venetian spy named Antonio Denardi. And his diary tells a new, explosive story, not one of military conquest, but of corporate espionage and political betrayal. It proves, with irrefutable evidence, that the city fell not just to the Sultan's cannons, but to the greed of a cabal of Genoese merchants who sold the secrets of the city's defenses to the Ottomans in exchange for trade monopolies. She was telling my story, she was telling my truth, and she was about to give the credit, the prize, the glory, to the man who had stolen it from me. I watched as my father patted Professor Finch on the back. I saw my mother beam with pride. The hope that had sustained me for the past few weeks began to feel like a cruel, sick joke. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to run out of the room. Dr. Reed looked down at her notes. This paper is a masterpiece of historical detective work. It is a paradigm-shifting contribution to our field. It will change the way we teach and write about this period for generations to come. She looked up. She looked directly at Table 7, at Professor Finch. He was placing his napkin neatly on the table. He was preparing to stand. He was a man seconds away from his crowning achievement. Dr. Reed picked up the heavy, bronze Kellerman Prize medal from the podium. For the paper, the silk and the sword. A new perspective on the fall of Constantinople, she announced, her voice ringing with a new, sharp authority, the 2025 Kellerman Prize. And the $50,000 honorarium that accompanies it is awarded to the paper's true and sole author. She paused. The entire room held its breath. Professor Finch had a brilliant, triumphant smile on his face. He had begun to push his chair back. Dr. Reed's eyes left his and began to scan the room. They moved past the front tables, past the middle rows, all the way to the back, all the way to my dark, hidden corner. Our eyes met, and she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. She was the one who had sent the email. And then she spoke the final words, the words that would detonate my entire world. Dr. Lena Petrova? The silence that followed was not a silence. It was a physical entity. It was a soundless, concussive blast that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. A room full of 500 people. And the only thing you could hear was the sound of a universe being rewritten. My own mind went completely, blissfully blank. I thought I had misheard. I thought I was having a stroke. Or a dream. Did she just say my name? I looked at Professor Finch. He was frozen, half risen from his chair, his body caught in a state of aborted triumph. The brilliant, victorious smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of pure, uncomprehending horror. His face, which had been flushed with pride, was now the color of wet ash. I looked at my parents. Their beaming, proud faces had collapsed into masks of utter, baffled confusion. They were looking around the room, then at Professor Finch, then back at the stage, their brains trying and failing to process the impossible information they had just received. And then, I felt it, the weight of 500 pairs of eyes turning, one by one, away from the front of the room, and searching the back, searching for me, the ghost at the feast, the footnote. Dr. Lena Petrova. Dr. Reed was still on stage. The bronze medal held in her hand, her calm, steady gaze fixed on me. Dr. Petrova, she said into the microphone, her voice echoing in the vast, silent ballroom. It was a question, but it was also a command, an invitation. Please come to the stage and accept your award. The world came rushing back in a roar of sound and light. I was no longer a ghost. I was the center of the story, and the stage was waiting for me. The walk from the back of that ballroom to the stage was the longest and shortest journey of my life. It felt like walking through water. Every step a slow, deliberate effort. The faces of 500 historians, the giants of my field, turned to watch me, their expressions a sea of baffled curiosity. The whispers started, a low rustling sound like wind through dry leaves. "Who is that, Petrova? Is this a mistake?" My eyes were fixed on the stage, on Dr. Evelyn Reed, who was watching me with a small, encouraging smile. But out of the corner of my vision, I could see Table 7. I could see my parents and my brother, their faces masks of utter slack-jawed confusion. And I could see Professor Alistair Finch. He had sunk back into his chair. All the color drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. And in a way, he had. He had seen me, the ghost he had tried to erase, resurrected in front of the entire world. As I reached the stage, the confused whispers in the room began to coalesce into something else, a tentative, then a growing, and finally, a thunderous wave of applause. They were beginning to understand. They didn't know the whole story, not yet, but they knew they had just witnessed a moment of profound academic drama. They knew they had just seen a stunning, public correction of the historical record. I reached the podium, my legs shaking. Dr. Reed stepped forward and placed the heavy, bronze Kellerman medal around my neck. Its weight was a solid, grounding, and beautiful thing. "Congratulations, Dr. Petrova," she whispered, her voice full of a warm, fierce pride. "Well deserved." She gestured for me to speak. I hadn't prepared a speech. I had been preparing to pack up my life and disappear. I stepped up to the microphone, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the blinding lights. "Thank you," I began, my voice a little shaky, but clear. "Thank you to the Kellerman Prize Committee. I am overwhelmed." I took a breath, my gaze sweeping past the front tables until it landed on my family. Their faces were still a picture of disbelief. "I want to thank the committee not just for this incredible honor, but for your diligence, for your profound commitment to academic integrity and to the truth." The words were pointed, and I could see a ripple of understanding go through some of the senior scholars in the room. "And finally," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "I want to thank Antonio Donardi, the 15th century Venetian spy whose secret story I was lucky enough to find. Thank you for trusting me with your truth after 500 years of silence." I didn't thank Professor Finch. I didn't thank my family. The omissions hung in the air, a final, damning verdict of their own. I gave a small nod and stepped back from the podium. The applause was deafening. As I stood there, dazed, a journalist from a major newspaper shouted a question from the floor. "Dr. Reed, can you clarify the committee's decision? The published paper lists Professor Finch as the author." Dr. Reed stepped back up to the microphone, her expression calm and authoritative. She was ready for this. "The Kellerman Prize is awarded for the work, not for the publication," she stated clearly. "The committee's due diligence is extensive. It includes a thorough review of all supporting research and, when applicable, the original, archived doctoral dissertations filed with the author's university." She paused, letting the weight of her words land. Our review made the identity of the work's originator unequivocally clear. This prize celebrates Dr. Petrova's remarkable and singular achievement. It was a public execution, delivered with the polite, professional grace of an academic guillotine. She had not called him a thief. She had simply stated the truth, and in doing so, she had destroyed him. The reception after the ceremony was a surreal whirlwind. I, who had been a pariah just days before, was suddenly the center of attention. I was surrounded by a crowd of people, all of them wanting to shake my hand, to congratulate me, to hear my story. Professors who had previously avoided my gaze were now clapping me on the back, telling me they always knew I had it in me. From across the room, I saw Finch trying to make a quiet exit. He was alone. The crowd of his admirers had vanished. His colleagues, his former friends, were now keeping a wide berth around him, as if his disgrace were a contagious disease. He looked old, small, and utterly broken. He caught my eye for a moment. his expression one of pure, pathetic desperation. Then he turned and disappeared through a side door. And then, my own family pushed their way through the crowd. Their faces were a mess of confusion, shame, and a desperate, fawning excitement. They had a winner now, and they were desperate to claim me. "Lena, darling," my mother cried, grabbing my arm. Her face was flushed, her eyes shining with a new, proprietary pride. "We are so proud of you, my brilliant daughter. We never doubted you for a moment." The lie was so audacious, so breathtaking, I almost laughed. "A misunderstanding. That's all it was," my father added, his voice a hearty, booming sound of denial. "We were just concerned for you, sweetheart. We always knew you were brilliant. This is a great day for the Archer family." "It's Petrova," I said, my voice quiet but cold. "My name is Dr. Petrova." I looked at them, at these people who were supposed to be my bedrock, my unconditional support. I looked at their eager, smiling faces, and I felt nothing. The part of my heart that had ached for their approval for 30 years was gone, cauterized by the fire of their betrayal. "No," I said, my voice steady, pulling my arm from my mother's grasp. "You weren't proud. You didn't believe me. You believed him? You told me I was crazy, that I was delusional, and that I should apologize for telling the truth. You chose his reputation over your own daughter. I will not forget that." Their smiles faltered. "We have nothing more to discuss tonight," I said. And I turned my back on them and walked away, leaving them standing alone in the middle of a crowded room, their faces finally, truly, registering the consequences of their choice. A year has passed. My life is a world away from what it was. The Silk and the Sword was published by Yale University Press 6 months ago. It was an expansion of my dissertation, and it came with a built-in, irresistible backstory. It was a sensation. It was lauded by critics. It sold out of its first printing in a month, and it is now required reading in Renaissance history programs across the country. Alistair Finch's career is over. The university launched a formal ethics investigation, faced with the irrefutable evidence from the archives. He was forced to resign in disgrace. He is a pariah in the academic world, a cautionary tale about hubris and theft. My own career has been a whirlwind. I was flooded with job offers from universities around the world. In the end, I accepted a tenure-track position at Yale, sponsored by Dr. Evelyn Reed, who has become not just a colleague, but a dear friend and mentor. I am a respected historian. I am a published author. I have a voice, and people listen to it. And my family. Our relationship is quiet and distant. They call, of course. They send me fawning, congratulatory texts about my latest interview or my book reviews. They are desperate to be a part of my new, successful life. They are desperate for me to forgive them, to let them back in, to allow them to bathe in the reflected glow of my success. But the trust is gone, and without trust, there is no foundation for a real relationship. I am polite, I am civil, but I am also distant. I have built a wall around my heart, a wall to protect myself from their conditional, transactional version of love. They have learned that my respect is no longer something they are entitled to. It is something they must, for the first time in their lives, try to earn. My father's greatest fear was that I would ruin my life by chasing a foolish dream. My mother's greatest fear was that I would embarrass the family name, and my brother. My brother just didn't want me to be more successful than him. They were all so afraid of me failing, but I think, deep down, what they were truly afraid of was that I might actually succeed, because my success, on my own terms, in my own way, was a judgment on their entire value system. In the end, this was never a story about a stolen thesis. It was a story about a stolen voice, and I had to go through the fire of betrayal, of loneliness, of despair, to finally, truly reclaim it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever been in a situation where the world, or the people you love, refused to believe you, where your truth was dismissed, please do not ever give up. Find your evidence, find your allies, and fight for your name. Hit that subscribe button if you believe the truth will, always, eventually, come to light. And remember, you are the author of your own story. Never, ever let anyone else put their name on it.